Hello everyone, my name is Professor Kim Soo-won and I teach at Graduate School of International and Area Studies in Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. In this class, we are going to talk about peace. And the first session is about international societies for peace in the Korean Peninsula. For over 1,000 years, the Korean Peninsula had been a unified state. Since the Shilla state formed the first unified kingdom in the 7th century, two more Korean dynasties ruled the land before the Japanese colonial occupation, Goryeo and Joseon. Between 1910 and 1945, the Empire of Japan annexed the peninsula and implemented a brutal form of oppressive rule. The surrender of Japan at the end of the World War II resulted in the rule of Korea, and the peninsula was subsequently divided by the two major superpowers of the time, the United States and the Soviet Union. While the division was meant to be a temporary measure, two formal independent states were announced in 1948. The Republic of Korea, ROK, in the south, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, in the north. The Korean War between 1950 and 1953 started by North Korea's invasion. But soon, DPRK, or North Korea, was pushed back by US-led coalition of the United Nations forces. The roles and impacts of diplomatic activities of hegemonic countries such as the US and the Soviet Union and even China is relatively well known to Korea studies scholars. The lesser known is the role of small or new states. Hence, I would like to talk about the history of the peace building in Korea with a focus on those smaller states. From the 1950s onwards, the two Koreas have competed against each other for international recognition as the one true Korea. The division of the peninsula coincided with the establishment of the UN system, and the UN military played a pivotal role in the Korean War, and the General Assembly in particular emerged as an important platform for the discussion on the future of each Korea as an internationally recognized legitimate state. The independence of most African states came later than that of the Koreas. But African states became members of the United Nations, while the two Koreas were still trapped in the Cold War dynamics between the US and the USSR, competing to gain international legitimacy by acquiring the UN membership. New African countries have gained significant power in the UN decision-making process in accordance with the one nation, one vote principle declared by the United Nations. While the United Nations in the 1950s were predominantly occupied by pro-United States, providing a diplomatic shelter to South Korea, the 1960s was different. In 1960 alone, 17 African states became independent and joined the United Nations. And the rapid decolonization of Africa resulted in a steady stream of new admissions to the United Nations. As the membership of the UN General Assembly changed through the admission of African states, the voting patterns of Korea-related resolutions changed as well. The anti-imperialist influx to the UN offered opportunities to North Korea, and the African continent became a key battleground for the Korean competition in the United Nations. Initially, North Korea overwhelmingly outperformed South Korea in building diplomatic relations with African states. In this photo, Kim Il-sung is shaking hands with Robert Mugabe, the first president of Zimbabwe. Mugabe is known to have liked North Korean ideology and culture. Another photo shows young Zimbabweans are performing martial arts in group, which they learned from North Korea. Many of the nationalists who led Africa's independence were pro-socialists who were influenced by Marxist-Leninist ideology. Newly independent and radical African states such as Tanzania were instinctively attracted to North Korea's anti-imperialistic rhetorics. Also, many African countries, including Angola, Zambia, Tanzania, and Ghana, received enormous support from socialist countries such as China and the Soviet Union during their struggle for independence. In the 1960s, most independent African states built close bonds with socialist countries, including North Korea. Because of this historical background, many African countries viewed North Korea as a more reliable partner than South Korea, a pro-capitalist country and US ally. North Korea actively engaged with Africa bilaterally and multilaterally as a vocal member of the non-aligned movement. Even though both Koreas tried to isolate the other from the international community, South Korea's initial engagement with Africa was dormant and passive compared to that of North Korea. At the time, the Korean government made efforts to establish close diplomatic relations with African countries in a short term when political support from African countries were needed. However, such short-term or one-time diplomatic strategies did not lead to long-term, mutually beneficial relationships with African countries. In 1976, the United Nations decided that the issue of Korea's accession to the United Nations would no longer be dealt with by the UN General Assembly. Soon after, Korea declared its foreign policy to diversify diplomatic relations with countries with different political systems and principles such as communism. Which means, finally, a foundation was laid for Korea-Africa relations to develop into a normal cooperative relationship. Yet Africa, the largest voting group with 28% of the United Nations General Assembly vote, remains to be the significant player in the new Korean issues, such as a race for the highest position of the United Nations and sanctions on North Korea's nuclear tests. Another small but important international society is the states in South Asia. A stamp was issued with photos of Indonesia's first President Sukarno and former President Kim Il-sung side by side. In 2015, Indonesia's Ministry of Information and Communication introduced this commemorative stamp produced in cooperation with the North Korean Embassy in Indonesia. This stamp was to commemorate the 50th anniversary of former President Kim Il-sung's visit to Indonesia. Kim Il-sung attended the Asia-Africa Conference and gave a speech on the socialist revolution, and Kim Jong-il accompanied him that time. The Indonesian government even named the orchid that Kim Il-sung loved Kim Il-sungjia, after him. The relationship with North Korea through the Sukarno family, Indonesia, continues. Relationships between North Korea and other ASEAN countries were also able to remain relatively solid, even amid the North Korean nuclear crisis, thanks to the traditional friendly relations, principles of neutrality by ASEAN, and the economic cooperation between ASEAN and North Korea. Of the 24 countries that have established embassies in Pyongyang, 5 are ASEAN countries, which are Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Malaysia. ASEAN countries maintained pretty friendly relations with North Korea up until just before 2017, when the North Korean nuclear issues got worsened. In 2018, Singapore played an important role in the Korean Peninsula issues by hosting the historic North Korea-US Summit. Singapore showed proactiveness by sharing North Korea's costs for the North Korea and the US Summit. In the past, ASEAN and African countries sparked diplomatic competition between South Korea and North Korea by upholding the principle of neutrality. In the beginning, Korea's diplomacy in Africa and ASEAN was driven by short-term gains. However, both Africa and ASEAN now occupy an important place in South Korea's diplomacy. President Roh Moo-hyun announced the Korea-Africa Initiative and laid a new foundation for Korea-Africa diplomacy. The importance of ASEAN countries have been further emphasized by the Moon Jae-in administration's new Southern policy. This consistency of diplomacy is being maintained under the Yoon Suk-yeol administration. The Indo-Pacific strategy, the backbone of Yoon Suk-yeol's foreign policy, includes Africa and supports ASEAN centrism. And Korea is now contributing to establishing peace in the region. And this class will examine Korea's peace contributive diplomacy. Thank you.